The developer's lawyer called early on a Monday morning in the spring of 2024. His voice was controlled, but only barely, the kind of control that comes from rehearsing bad news in the car before dialing. "We have a problem," Theron Hartwell said. On the other end, the senior partners of Ridgeline Development Group listened in silence. They had spent nearly a decade assembling 340 acres east of State Route 9 in Brecken County, Tennessee. Retail space residential housing, a mixed-use project valued at just over $30 million. Permits were filed. Engineers had signed off. Contractors were on standby. The earth movers were sitting in a rented lot outside Nashville, burning daily lease fees, waiting for a green light that now might never come. "The entire project is blocked," Hartwell continued. "Blocked by what? A strip of land, 12 feet wide, half a mile long. Silence. Who owns it? A farmer, 85 years old. He bought it in 2001 for $8,000. More silence. Someone at the table set down a pen. Someone else leaned forward and pressed both palms flat against the conference table as if bracing for impact. "How much does he want?" Hartwell paused. "He hasn't called back. $30 million. 10 years of planning. Exposed utility lines and traffic studies and zoning variances and engineering reports and environmental impact assessments, and 3 separate rounds of financing from 2 different banks. All of it sitting still because of 12 feet of grass, and one man who had waited 23 years for this phone call. His name was Garth Callister, and to understand how he got here, you have to go back 25 years, not to a boardroom, not to a courthouse, but to a small county library where nobody else bothered to go. The Brecken County Public Library sat at the end of a narrow road lined with pin oaks that had been there longer than anyone alive could remember. It was a brick building with a flat roof and fluorescent lights that buzzed when the weather turned cold. The carpet in the main hall was the color of weak coffee. The ceiling tiles had water stains that nobody had repaired since the Clinton administration. Most people came for paperback novels or to let their children use the computers. Almost nobody walked past the front desk, through the back hallway, and into the records room. Garth Callister did. Once a month, every month, for as long as the staff could remember. He was 62 years old in the autumn of 1999. His hands were rough from decades of working land. He did not own enough of knuckles swollen at the joints, fingernails clean, but permanently ridged from years of soil and weather. His shirts were always clean, even when he came straight from the field. He had small eyes set deep under a heavy brow, the kind of eyes that moved slowly but missed nothing. He had never attended college. He had never left Tennessee for more than a week. And he had a habit that nobody in Brecken County understood. He read county records, old zoning maps, road surveys, easement filings, infrastructure proposals from decades earlier, minutes from planning commission meetings that even the commissioners had forgotten. He would sit in the corner of that back room under the fluorescent hum, turning pages that smelled like dust and old ink, and he would read for hours. He brought his own pencil and a small pad of graph paper. He never checked out a book. He never used the computers. He came for the filing cabinets and the binders of municipal records, and he treated them with the kind of reverence that other men reserve for scripture. The librarian, a woman named Doris who had worked there since 1987, once asked him what he was looking for. Garth looked up from a 1974 drainage survey and said, "I'll know when I find it." Then he went back to reading. His wife Lenore called it homework. Garth called it paying attention. To understand why Garth Callister paid this kind of attention, you have to understand what happened to his father. In the summer of 1953, Ansel Callister owned 110 acres of good farmland outside Brecken. It had been in the family for 2 generations. Ansel was not an educated man, but he was a decent one. He worked hard and he trusted people who wore ties because he believed that men who dressed well had earned the right to be believed. He went to church on Sunday and paid his debts on time, and he assumed that the world operated on the same principles that he did. A timber company from Knoxville sent a man in a tie. The man arrived on a Tuesday afternoon driving a clean sedan that looked out of place on the dirt road leading to the Callister property. He sat at the kitchen table and drank iced tea and talked about the hardwood market. Then he offered Ansel $1,200 for the right to harvest timber from the northern 40 acres. He slid a contract across the table with a fountain pen resting on top. Ansel read the first page of the contract. It seemed straightforward. He signed it. He did not read the second page. He did not read the third. Buried in the language of the third page was a clause that granted the timber company a transferable interest in the surface rights of the entire property. Not just the northern 40, all of it. The clause was written in the kind of language that lawyers understand and farmers do, not nested subclauses and conditional phrases and references to statutes that Ansel Martin had never heard of. Within 18 months, the company used that clause to assert full ownership of the land. They brought a surveyor. They brought a sheriff's deputy. They brought a second contract that Ansel had never signed, but that referenced the first one as if the two were inseparable. Ansel Callister went from landowner to tenant in the time it took to dry the ink on one signature. Garth was 14 years old. He came home from school that afternoon and found his father sitting on the front steps of the house that was no longer theirs. Ansel's boots were covered in mud. His hat was in his lap. He was staring at the tree line across the field, but he was not seeing the trees. He was seeing something else, something that had been taken from him while he sat at his own kitchen table and drank his own iced tea and trusted a man because the man wore a tie. Ansel said nothing for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the yard. A dog barked somewhere down the road. Then Ansel spoke one sentence, the only lesson he ever gave his son directly. Don't ever sign anything you haven't read 3 times. Garth never forgot that sentence. It became the foundation on which he built every decision for the rest of his life. He read everything. He trusted paper more than promises. And he understood at an age when most boys were thinking about baseball and girls in summer that land could be taken away by carelessness, not by force, not by weather, not by act of God, by a single moment of not paying attention, by one page left unread. That was why Garth Callister sat in the back room of the Brecken County Public Library on an October evening in 1999, turning pages no one else cared about. And that was why when he found what he found, he understood exactly what it meant. It was a county road expansion proposal from 1956. State Route 9, the 2-lane road that ran north to south along the eastern edge of Brecken County, had been scheduled for widening. The State Highway Department proposed adding a lane in each direction to handle projected traffic growth from a planned industrial corridor that never materialized. To make room for the expansion, the county surveyed a narrow corridor along the eastern boundary of the existing road, 12 feet wide, running roughly half a mile along a stretch where the road curved gently past open farmland. The corridor was formally designated as a separate parcel of land, assigned a number filed with the county recorder, and entered into the tax rolls. It was called Parcel 7C. The designation was routine. Dozens of similar corridors were created across Tennessee during the highway expansion era of the 1950s. Most of them were eventually absorbed back into the surrounding properties when the projects they served were completed or canceled. But Parcel 7C was different. The project it was created for was canceled in 1961 when the state pulled funding. The widening never happened. The survey crew never came back. The industrial corridor never materialized. The corridor was forgotten by every office and every official who had ever been involved in creating it. And one critical detail had never been cleaned up. Parcel 7C was never legally dissolved. It was never merged back into the adjacent land. It was never sold, never claimed, never built upon, never rezoned. It simply sat there on the county records, a ghost parcel 12 feet wide and half a mile long, technically real, but practically invisible. A loose thread in the fabric of county bureaucracy that nobody had bothered to pull. Garth read the filing 3 times the way his father had told him to read everything. Then he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a full minute while the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper and drew a map by hand. He used a pencil and a plastic ruler Lenore kept in the junk drawer. He drew Route 9 as a vertical line. He drew the corridor as a thin rectangle running alongside it. Then he drew what lay on either side. To the west of Route 9, scattered farmland, small plots, some wooded areas, a few houses set back from the road. Nothing unusual, nothing that would attract the attention of anyone with money and ambition. To the east, something different. Hundreds of acres of flat, open ground. No houses, no barns, no structures of any kind. Just pasture and scrub land stretching toward a tree line half a mile away. Cheap land, empty land. The kind of land that sits quietly for decades, taxed at agricultural rates passed over by developers who are looking for something closer to a highway or a city, until one day someone with a longer timeline and a bigger vision notices it before anyone else does. Garth stared at the map for a long time. He traced the corridor with his finger. 12 feet wide, it ran right along the edge of Route 9, right between the road and all that open land to the east. If anyone ever wanted to build something on those eastern acres, if anyone ever wanted to develop them into housing or retail or commercial space, they would need a way in. They would need a road. And the geography was not kind. Wetlands spread across the southern boundaries, soft ground that would not support road construction without millions of dollars in fill and drainage work. Private property blocked the western approach from Route 9 itself, parcels owned by families who had lived there for generations and showed no interest in selling. The northern edge was steep, rising sharply toward a ridge that would require extensive grading and would never pass a traffic safety review for a main entrance. The only feasible path for a road into that land ran along the eastern edge of Route 9, through the narrow gap between the existing road and the open acreage, straight through the corridor, straight through Parcel 7C. Garth folded the map and placed it inside his notebook. Then he picked up the phone and called his neighbor. Dewey Prescott lived a quarter mile down the road. He had known Garth for 30 years. They were not close friends in the way that men in cities understand friendship. They did not go to dinner or call each other on birthdays. But they helped each other during harvest, and they lent each other equipment without keeping track, and they told each other the truth, which in rural Tennessee counted for more than most things. Dewey, you remember that open land east of Route 9? Sure, Dewey said. Nothing out there. Been that way my whole life. Garth paused. Not yet. Dewey waited for more. Garth said nothing else. They hung up. Dewey stood in his kitchen for a moment afterward, holding the receiver, wondering what that meant. Then he set it down and went back to watching television. He would not understand what Garth had been talking about for another 23 years. For the next 18 months, Garth watched, quietly, patiently. Every trip into town, every drive to the feed store, every Sunday after church, he took the long way past Route 9 and looked east. He noticed things that other people drove past without seeing. Survey flags appeared along the fence line, small orange markers on wire stakes that meant someone was measuring. Fresh tire tracks cut through the grass where no trucks had been before. New fence stakes were driven into ground that had been untouched for years. Someone was paying attention to land that nobody had paid attention to in decades. Then in early 2000, a survey crew showed up. 2 trucks, 2 full days of work. They measured, photographed, marked the ground with spray paint and GPS coordinates, and said nothing to anyone. When a farmer from down the road asked them what they were doing, they said they were conducting a boundary verification for a private client. They did not say which client, they did not say why. 3 months later, 40 acres changed hands. The buyer was listed as a limited liability company registered in Nashville. The name Ridgeline Holdings, LLC, meant nothing to anyone in Brecken County. 6 months after that, another 60 acres were sold, and also to an LLC with a Nashville address but a different name. Then more and more. Each purchase was small enough to avoid attention. Each buyer was a different LLC. But all of them traced back through layers of corporate filings that most people would never bother to read to the same parent company. Garth read them. He drove to the State Business Registry office in Nashville on a Tuesday morning and spent 4 hours tracing the chain of ownership. He brought his notebook and his pencil and his reading glasses, and he sat at a public terminal and followed the paper trail the way a hunter follows tracks through mud. Lenore had given him the notebook earlier that year. It was a simple composition book with a black and white marbled cover, the kind students use in school. She had bought it at the drugstore for $1.49. She had no idea when she handed it to him with a cup of coffee one morning that it would become the most important book in their house. One evening, she asked what he was tracking. "A pattern," he said. "What kind of pattern?" He looked at her across the kitchen table. The same table where they had eaten every meal for 30 years. The same table where they had argued about money and laughed about neighbors and planned their children's futures and sat in silence when there was nothing to say and the silence was enough. The kind that takes time to see. By the summer of 2001, nearly 280 acres east of Route 9 had been quietly assembled by a single entity. Garth traced the LLCs back through county filings and state business records until he found the parent company. Ridgeline Development Group, Nashville address. A portfolio of commercial and residential projects across Middle Tennessee strip malls and subdivisions and mixed-use developments that turned empty land into revenue. Then he confirmed the part that mattered most, the part that turned his theory into certainty. The land had no usable road access, wetlands to the south, private property to the west, impractical terrain to the north. The only legal path into or out of those 280 acres ran along the eastern edge of Route 9 through a 12-foot corridor that existed on paper but had been forgotten by everyone in the county, everyone in the state, everyone in the offices of Ridgeline Development Group, everyone except Garth Callister. And in March of 2001, the Brecken County Bank put that corridor up for auction. Opening bid $5,000. Garth did the math. Ridgeline had already spent millions acquiring the land. Engineering studies, environmental assessments, legal fees for setting up the LLC's property taxes on 280 acres of undeveloped ground. Millions of dollars invested, and they still did not own the one piece they needed most. A 12-foot strip of grass that the bank was about to sell to whoever raised a hand first. Garth set his limit at $8,000, just to make sure he got there first. The auction was held on a Tuesday morning in a room that smelled like old carpet and instant coffee. A folding table served as the auctioneer's desk. A water stain on the ceiling had been there so long it had its own geography. Four locals stood near the back wall holding styrofoam cups, not bidding on anything, just watching the way people in small towns watch things happen because there is not much else to do on a Tuesday morning. The bank was clearing out foreclosed properties and abandoned parcels. Most of them were scraps. Odd-shaped lots behind gas stations, drainage easements along creek beds, slivers of land that had fallen through the cracks of ownership and ended up on the county's books as liabilities rather than assets. Nobody came to these auctions expecting to find treasure. They came because they had nothing better to do, or because they hoped to pick up a quarter acre for back taxes and maybe park a trailer on it. Carver Mosley stood near the auctioneer's table, not bidding, just observing. He was the branch manager of Brecken County Bank. About 50 years old, vest buttoned over a white shirt, polished shoes, hair combed back with the kind of precision that suggested he checked it in mirrors more than once a day. He had a thin mouth and a wide forehead, and the particular posture of a man who believes he has earned his position through merit rather than circumstance. He was the type of man who believed he understood the value of everything because he approved the loans that paid for it. He carried that certainty the way some men carry wallets, always within reach, always ready to show. The auctioneer read from his list in a flat voice, moving through the parcels, the way a man reads a grocery receipt, without enthusiasm, without expectation. Parcel 7C, 12 feet wide, half a mile long, eastern boundary of State Route 9. Opening bid $5,000. Nobody moved. A few of the watchers by the coffee pot exchanged glances. One of them smirked. 12 feet wide, half a mile of nothing. The auctioneer looked up from his clipboard. 5,000 for half a mile of grass. Anybody? A hand rose in the back of the room. Clean shirt, work boots, 62 years old. Sitting alone in a folding chair with his hat on his knee. Garth Callister. 5,000 to the gentleman in the back. A voice near the coffee pot spoke up. A man Garth did not recognize, middle-aged, wearing a windbreaker and jeans. 6. The auctioneer nodded. 6,000, looking for 7. Garth did not look at the man who bid against him. He did not look at the auctioneer. He did not look at Carver Mosley or the watchers or the coffee pot. He looked at the table in front of him, where his hands rested flat and still, palms down, fingers spread the way a man's hands rest when his mind is already made up and his body is simply waiting for the world to catch up. 8! The room turned. $8,000 for a strip of grass that most people would not bother to mow. The man in the windbreaker raised his eyebrows, looked at the auctioneer, and shook his head. No counter. Before the hammer came down, a laugh broke through the quiet. It was loud enough for every person in the room to hear. Not a chuckle, not a polite cough. A full open laugh, the kind that is meant to be noticed, meant to communicate something beyond amusement. Carver Mosley, branch manager, standing by the auctioneer's desk, his thin mouth stretched into a smile that did not reach his eyes. $8,000 for a 12-foot strip of nothing, he said, not quite to anyone, not quite to himself, but pitched at exactly the volume required for everyone to hear. He looked directly at Garth. Some people collect problems. A few people laughed with him. Not everyone, but enough. The sound bounced off the low ceiling and settled over the room like dust. Garth did not look up. He signed the purchase agreement with the pen the auctioneer offered. He folded the receipt carefully once, twice, and placed it in his coat pocket. Then he stood, put on his hat, and walked toward the door. Carver intercepted him at the entrance. His voice still carried the residue of laughter, but his eyes did not match his mouth. There was something sharper behind them. The need to be right. The discomfort of watching someone act in a way he could not explain. Garth, I've known you a long time. You're a decent man, but I have to be honest with you. He paused as if honesty required preparation. You just threw away $8,000. I see people do this all the time. Buy cheap land, convince themselves they're smarter than the market. They hold it for a few years, pay taxes on it, realize it's worth exactly what they paid for it, and then they sell it back at a loss. Nobody's smarter than the market. Garth looked at him. It was the first time he had made eye contact with anyone that morning. "Thank you, Carver," he said. Then he walked past him through the glass doors into the parking lot and drove home. He did not look back. He did not need to see the expression on Carver's face because he already knew what it looked like, the expression of a man who was certain he was right about everything and who would spend the next 23 years discovering that certainty and accuracy are not the same thing. Lenore was waiting at the kitchen table when he came through the door. She had a cup of coffee in front of her, half finished, and she was reading the newspaper, though she put it down the moment she heard his boots on the porch. "Did you get it?" "We got it." "And now what?" Garth hung his coat on the hook by the door. He sat down across from her. The deed was in his shirt pocket, folded once pressed flat against his chest. "Now we wait." Lenore had known this man for 38 years. She had married him when she was 23 and he was 24 in a small church with a leaking roof and a preacher who talked too long. She had raised 2 children with him, buried his father with him, survived 3 bad harvests and 1 house fire, and the quiet daily accumulation of a shared life that was never easy but was always honest. She had watched him make decisions that other people questioned, and she had watched those decisions turn out right more often than anyone expected. She knew the difference between Garth guessing and Garth being certain. When he guessed, his eyes moved scanning, recalculating. When he was certain, they stayed still. His eyes were still now. "How long?" she asked. "However long it takes." She nodded, once stood up and put the kettle on. They did not talk about the land again for years. Lenore was not a passive woman. She managed the household finances with the precision of a bookkeeper and the discipline of a woman who had grown up without enough. She knew exactly what $8,000 meant. It was the money they had set aside to fix the roof, a project they had postponed twice already. It was 2 years of careful saving. It was not nothing. 8,000 bushels was the difference between getting through winter comfortably and getting through winter carefully, and she knew the difference between those 2 things better than most people ever would. But she had learned something about Garth over 38 years of marriage. Every time he said wait, a result eventually came. Not always a big one, not always a profitable one, but the man did not use that word carelessly. He said wait the way carpenters say measure twice, not as advice, as practice. So she waited with him. That first spring, Garth drove out to Parcel 7C on a Saturday morning with a push mower in the bed of his truck. He parked on the gravel shoulder of Route 9, unloaded the mower, and walked the strip end to end before he started cutting. 12 feet of grass, half a mile long, wild clover and crabgrass and a few thistles pushing up through the dirt. No fence, no marker, no sign that anyone had ever cared about this ground or intended to do anything with it. Just a thin rectangle of land that the county had surveyed 43 years earlier and then abandoned an unfinished thought in the long, slow conversation between government and geography. Garth mowed it, the whole thing. It took him most of the morning. When he was done, he stood at the southern end and looked east across the open land where Ridgeline Development Group had quietly purchased 280 acres without ever realizing what they had missed. Nothing was there yet. No construction, no signs, no crews, just flat ground and tall grass stretching toward the tree line shimmering in the late morning heat. But Garth knew. He had read the records. He had traced the purchases. He had drawn the map. And he had the deed in his pocket. He loaded the mower back into the truck and drove home. Years later, his daughter Darlene would remember a specific afternoon in 1995. She was 12 years old. Garth had spread a county zoning map across the kitchen table and called her over. She came reluctantly, expecting to be bored. Instead, Garth pointed to a line on the map and said something she never forgot. "You see this road here?" She nodded. "Every road has to go through somewhere, and that somewhere always belongs to someone." She did not fully understand what he meant. She was 12, but the sentence lodged itself in her memory the way certain things do when a parent speaks with unusual weight, when the voice drops and the hand stops moving, and the air in the room changes, and she carried it with her through law school, through 16 years of property litigation, through every case she ever argued about access and easements and rights of way. She would need it, not yet, but someday. Garth paid his taxes on Parcel 7C every year, $47, always on time. He kept the boundary markers clear. He mowed the strip twice each year, spring and fall, and he told no one why. The deed stayed in his desk drawer at home. The notebook stayed on the kitchen table, open, waiting for new entries. To everyone else in Brecken County, it was 12 feet of grass beside Route 9. A curiosity, a punchline if they remembered it at all. To Garth Callister, it was unfinished business. And unfinished business was something he understood better than most men alive. His father had taught him that not with words after the first lesson, but with the way Ansel Callister had spent the rest of his life. Working land he no longer owned. Paying rent to a company that had taken his home with a fountain pen and 3 pages of legal language. Never complaining, never recovering. Garth had decided at 14 that he would never be caught the same way. He would read every page. He would understand every clause. And when his moment came, he would be ready. The moment had not come yet, but the deed was in his drawer, and the notebook was on his table, and the grass was freshly mowed. And Garth Callister was a patient man. 3 years after the auction, Ridgeline Development Group put up a fence. Garth saw it on a Wednesday morning in April of 2004, driving the back way into town to pick up feed. New posts, steel wire, clean cuts in the earth where the holes had been drilled with a mechanical auger, the dirt still fresh and dark around each base. The fence ran along the eastern perimeter of the land Ridgeline had been assembling for years, enclosing what was now well over 300 acres of flat Tennessee ground. Garth slowed his truck to a crawl. He followed the fence line with his eyes south to north, watching it stretch into the distance, post after post, disappearing toward the tree line. Then he saw where it stopped. The fence ran straight and unbroken for nearly a quarter mile. Then it ended, abruptly, right at the boundary of Parcel 7C. The post stopped. The wire stopped. 12 feet of open ground separated the end of Ridgeline's fence from the shoulder of Route 9. They knew the corridor existed. They knew its boundaries. They had surveyed right up to the edge of it, but they did not know who owned it. Garth pulled onto the shoulder, killed the engine, and sat in his truck for a full 5 minutes staring at the gap. The morning sun came through the windshield and lit up the dust on the dashboard. A mockingbird sang from a telephone wire overhead. The world was quiet and still, and Garth sat in the middle of it, looking at 12 feet of empty ground that a multi-million-dollar company had carefully built around without understanding why they had to. Then he reached into the glove box, pulled out his notebook, and wrote a single entry. They know, but they don't know enough. He started the truck and drove to the feed store without mentioning it to anyone. That Thanksgiving, the whole family gathered at the house on Route 9. Lenore cooked a turkey that was slightly too large for the oven, the way she did every year because she believed in abundance even when the budget did not agree. The kitchen smelled like sage and butter, and the particular warmth that only comes from a house where someone has been cooking since dawn. Dalton drove down from 2 counties over, arriving late with grease still under his fingernails from a morning call. He was a plumber, 36 years old, broad across the shoulders, with hands that were permanently roughened from wrenches and soldering torches, and the cold water that ran through the pipes he spent his days repairing. Darlene came from Knoxville, where she was in her second year of college, quieter than her brother, watching more than she spoke. The table was crowded. Garth carved the turkey. Lenore passed the dishes. For a while, the conversation moved the way it does in families that see each other only on holidays, catching up on surface things. Weather, neighbors, a cousin's new baby, the price of feed, the new stoplight on Main Street that nobody thought was necessary. Then Dalton set down his fork. Dad, that piece of land, the strip by Route 9. The table went quiet. Lenore stopped reaching for the breadbasket. Darlene looked at her father. You have some kind of plan for it, or are you just holding on? Garth met his son's eyes. Dalton was practical in a way that left little room for patience. He fixed things for a living. When a pipe leaked, you replaced it. When a joint failed, you soldered a new one. Problems were things that existed in the present tense and required solutions in the present tense, and the idea of waiting years for a solution to reveal itself was as foreign to him as speaking another language. I have a plan, Garth said. Then tell us. Not yet. Dalton exhaled through his nose. Dad, you always say not yet. The roof leaks, not yet. The truck breaks down, not yet. You spent $8,000 on a strip of grass and you can't even tell your own family why. Lenore intervened gently. Dalton, eat your dinner. Darlene, 20 years old and home from college, said nothing, but she watched her father's face. She remembered the map on the kitchen table when she was 12. She remembered what he had told her about roads and the land they passed through. She did not understand yet what her father was doing, but she understood that he was doing something. And she trusted the quality of his silence more than most people's explanations. Dalton picked up his fork. The meal continued, but something had shifted in the air between father and son, a tension that would build over the next 2 decades, fed by love and frustration in equal measure. 2 years later, in the spring of 2006, a man Garth had never seen before knocked on his front door. He was young, maybe 30, wearing khaki pants and a polo shirt with a small logo stitched on the chest. He carried a clipboard and had the slightly lost expression of someone who had been driving rural roads all morning looking for addresses that did not match his GPS. Good morning, sir. My name is Kevin. I'm with a surveying firm out of Nashville. We're doing some title research for a client, and I was wondering if you might know who owns a narrow strip of land that runs along the east side of Route 9, about 12 feet wide. Garth was sitting on his front porch drinking tea from a mug that had lost its handle 3 years earlier. He looked at the young man for a moment. The kid was nervous. He kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other, and his clipboard was angled away from Garth, as if he did not want anyone to read what was written on it. I know that strip, Garth said. The surveyor's eyes brightened. You wouldn't happen to know who the owner is? Garth took a sip of his tea. What do you need it for? The young man hesitated. He glanced down at his clipboard, then back up. Our client just needs to verify some records, routine stuff. Garth nodded slowly. Well, good luck with that. The surveyor waited for more. None came. He stood on the porch for an awkward moment, then thanked Garth, walked back to his truck, and drove away. Garth watched the dust settle behind the tires. Lenore stepped out onto the porch. Who was that? Garth watched the truck disappear around the bend. Someone looking for something their client should have found before they bought 280 acres of land. Lenore looked at her husband. In their years together, she had seen him satisfied, She had seen him worried. She had seen him angry exactly twice. But the expression on his face now was none of those things. It was something quieter, a confirmation. The look of a man who had read the map correctly and was now watching the territory prove him right, one visitor at a time. She went back inside. Garth finished his tea and wrote the date in his notebook. Then came 2008, and everything almost fell apart. The real estate agent arrived on a Saturday afternoon in September. He was young, polished, wearing a suit that cost more than Garth's monthly grocery bill. His car was a silver sedan with leather seats that Garth could see through the open window. He introduced himself with a handshake that was firm in the way that sales training teaches, not too hard, not too soft, designed to communicate confidence without aggression. He offered $80,000 for Parcel 7C, 10 times what Garth had paid. Garth listened politely, the way he listened to everything, completely without interruption, giving the young man the courtesy of finishing his pitch before responding. "I appreciate the offer," he said. "I'm not interested." The agent's smile did not waver, but something behind it shifted. "The number could go higher." "I'm sure it can," Garth said. Then he closed the door. Not hard, not in anger, just closed it the way you close a book you have already finished reading. Lenore had heard everything from the kitchen. She came to the hallway drying her hands on a dish towel. $80,000. Garth nodded. "That's a lot of money." "It is. And you said no." "I did." She looked at him for a moment. Her expression was not disapproval. It was not confusion. It was the particular expression of a woman who has made peace with the fact that her husband sees things she cannot see, and who has decided after decades of evidence that this is a feature rather than a flaw. She went back to the kitchen. She did not ask again. But $80,000 was not the only thing that arrived in 2008. The financial crisis hit Brecken County the way it hit every rural community in America, slowly at first like a weather system building on the horizon, then all at once like the storm itself. Crop prices dropped. Feed costs rose. The margins that had kept small farms alive for decades compressed until there was almost nothing left. Neighbors who had farmed their land for generations began selling parcels to pay mortgages. The feed store cut its hours. The church started a food pantry. Garth's income from the land he worked fell by nearly half that year. And then Lenore's knee gave out. She had been dealing with the pain for years, managing it with over-the-counter medication and the kind of stubbornness that rural women develop as a survival skill, the ability to keep walking on a joint that screams with every step, because there are meals to cook and animals to feed and a household to run, and nobody else is going to do it. But by October of 2008, she could barely walk to the mailbox. The doctor said she needed a total knee replacement. Insurance covered part of it. The rest landed on the kitchen table in the form of bills that arrived weekly, then daily, each one a little more urgent than the last, printed on paper that smelled like the inside of a hospital. Dalton called on a Sunday evening. His voice was not angry. It was heavy. The voice of a man carrying a weight he could not set down. "Dad, $80,000. Mom needs surgery. The roof is leaking into the bedroom now, not just the attic. What are you holding on to, a strip of grass?" Garth was standing in the kitchen looking out the window at the dark field beyond the yard. The window was old, and the glass was slightly warped, so the field looked like it was underwater, wavering and uncertain. "I know what I'm doing, Dalton." "Then explain it to me." "I can't. Not yet. You know how tired I am of that answer. I've been hearing it since I was a kid. Not yet. Not yet. When, Dad? When is it going to be yet?" The line went dead. Dalton had hung up. But this time Garth understood something he had missed during Thanksgiving 3 years earlier. Dalton was not angry about money. He was angry because his father did not trust him enough to tell him the truth. And that kind of anger does not fade with time. It compounds. That night, Garth sat alone at the kitchen table. Lenore was in bed, her knee wrapped in ice, the prescription bottles lined up on the nightstand like soldiers in a line. The house was quiet except for the sound of the furnace clicking on and off, the rhythm of a house breathing through the cold. In front of him on the table sat a small piece of paper, the real estate agent's business card, white with raised black lettering, a Nashville phone number. Garth picked up the phone. He dialed the first 4 digits of the number. His finger hovered over the 5th. Then he stopped, not because he was brave, not because he suddenly remembered his long-term plan and found strength in the certainty of it. He stopped because Lenore appeared in the doorway. She was leaning on the frame, her weight on her good leg, her face tight with pain that she was trying not to show. She wore the old flannel robe he had given her for Christmas 6 years ago, the one with the worn cuffs. She looked at him. She looked at the phone in his hand. She looked at the business card on the table. She said nothing. She did not need to. Her face said everything. Not anger, not disappointment, not fear. Something closer to the expression she had worn on the day he came home from the auction with the deed in his pocket. Trust. The deep, unreasonable, unshakable trust of a woman who has spent a lifetime watching a quiet man make decisions that turn out right. She stood there for maybe 5 seconds. Then she turned and went back to the bedroom. He heard the bed creak as she lowered herself down. He heard the rustle of blankets. Then silence. Garth set the phone down. He stared at the card for a long time. Then he put it in the trash. The next morning, he called the insurance company and negotiated a payment plan for the surgical bills. He sold his second truck, one he used for hauling, for $4,200. He picked up extra work mending fences for a neighboring cattle operation. He tightened every line of the household budget until there was nothing left to tighten. He did not sell the land. Lenore had her surgery 3 weeks later at the county hospital. It went well. When she woke up still cloudy from anesthesia, her eyes unfocused and her voice thin, Garth was sitting beside her bed. He had been there for 2 hours, sitting in a plastic chair that was too small for him, his hat on his knee, watching the monitors beep and the IV drip and the slow rise and fall of her breathing. She turned her head toward him. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You still have it." He knew what she meant. He had always known what she meant, even when she did not say it directly, even when the words she used were small and the meaning behind them was vast. "I do." "Good." Then she closed her eyes and slept. Garth sat beside her for 2 more hours, watching her breathe, thinking about the fact that she had said good. Not why, not how, not what's your plan, just good. As if the word itself were enough. As if trust once given does not need to be renewed, only honored. The years after 2008 moved slowly. Garth continued to pay $47 in annual taxes on Parcel 7C. He continued to mow it twice a year. The roof got patched, then patched again, then finally replaced with money he saved over 3 years by eating less meat and driving less often. The kitchen faucet dripped for 6 months before he fixed it. The porch railing loosened and he tightened it. The small, ordinary maintenance of a life lived carefully within means without waste. In 2012, the county made its move. A commissioner called Garth at home and offered $120,000 for the strip. The county was exploring the possibility of road improvements along Route 9 and wanted to acquire the corridor for future use. Garth thanked the man and declined. "May I ask why?" the commissioner said. "Because it isn't time." "Time for what?" Garth did not answer. The commissioner waited. The silence stretched. Then the commissioner said he understood, which was a polite way of saying he did not understand at all, and hung up. The commissioner, a man named Bill Drucker, mentioned the call to Carver Mosley at a Rotary Club meeting that Thursday. Carver told 2 people. Those 2 told 4. Within a week, the story of Garth Callister turning down 6 figures for a strip of grass had circled through every diner and hardware store in Brecken County. It was the kind of story that small towns love, a mixture of admiration and disbelief, and the quiet satisfaction of watching someone else make a decision you would never make yourself. That was how Vivian Yarborough found out. Vivian was 38, a reporter for the Brecken County Register, the kind of small-town newspaper that published once a week and covered everything from school board meetings to church bake sales to the annual county fair pig judging. She was sharp, curious, and perpetually underpaid. When she heard the story about Garth, she put it in her weekly column under the heading County Notes. The item was short, 3 sentences, written in a tone that walked the line between admiration and amusement. Garth Callister of Route 9 recently turned down a 6-figure offer for a strip of land narrower than his hallway. Perhaps he knows something the rest of us don't, or perhaps not. In a city that would have been forgotten by lunchtime, in Brecken County, it became the kind of story people brought up at the post office, at the gas station, at the counter of the diner where the coffee was weak and the gossip was strong. Garth noticed the change. At the feed store, a man he barely knew asked when he was going to sell the $1 million lawn. At the gas station, someone laughed a little too long when Garth's name came up. At church, a woman he had known for 20 years patted his arm and said, "Garth, honey, you're too smart to be this stubborn," which was the most Tennessee way possible of calling someone a fool. Dewey Prescott came by the house one afternoon and found Garth restringing a fence line. Dewey did not waste time with pleasantries. "People are laughing at you," he said. Garth did not look up from the wire. "People laughed at my father too, the day he lost the farm." Dewey went quiet. In 30 years of knowing Garth, he had never once heard the man mention Ansel Callister. The silence lasted a long time. A crow called from the fence post at the end of the row. The wire hummed in Garth's hands. When Dewey left that afternoon, he walked slower than he had arrived. Something between them had changed. He never called Garth foolish again. Vivian Yarborough, meanwhile, did not forget the story either. Something about it nagged at her the way a loose thread nags at a person who sews. A sane, practical farmer turning down $120,000 for a piece of land that generated no income and served no visible purpose. She began pulling records on Parcel 7C, on Ridgeline Development Group, on the pattern of land purchases east of Route 9. She wrote nothing more about it, but she kept a file, and the file kept growing. In 2016, Ridgeline finally came themselves. Not an agent, not a surveyor with a clipboard, a lawyer. Theron Hartwell, 45 years old, 3-piece suit, leather briefcase, the kind of man whose shoes were always polished and whose handshake came with a business card that had embossed lettering. He drove down from Nashville in a black sedan and knocked on Garth's door on a Tuesday morning. He offered $250,000. Garth invited him inside. He poured coffee into 2 mugs, one chipped, one not, and offered Hartwell the unchipped one. He listened carefully to the pitch, the number, the terms, the timeline, the assurances that this was the highest offer Garth would receive, that the market did not support a higher valuation, that $250,000 for 12 feet of unimproved land was not just generous but extraordinary. Hartwell spoke well. He had done this before. He had a way of making large numbers sound like they were doing the listener a favor simply by existing. When he finished, Garth looked at him over the rim of his coffee cup. "Tell your client I have been patient too, longer than he has." Hartwell blinked. He opened his mouth to counter, then closed it. He looked at Garth for a long moment, trying to read something in the old man's face that would tell him what the next move should be. He found nothing. Garth's face was as still as his eyes. Hartwell set down his coffee, picked up his briefcase, and left. Garth watched him drive away from the kitchen window. The black sedan looked as out of place on the gravel road as the timberman's clean car had looked on his father's dirt road 63 years earlier. That evening in Nashville, Hartwell sat in a conference room across from Ridgeline's project director and delivered his report. He won't sell. Everyone has a price. This man doesn't. He knows something we don't. The project director leaned back in his chair. The conference room was on the 14th floor. Through the window, the Nashville skyline glittered. Then find another way. If we can't buy it, find a legal route to take it. Hartwell returned to his office that night and began researching alternatives. He stayed at his desk until midnight reading case law and the legal mechanisms by which private land can be acquired when the owner refuses to sell. Ridgeline was preparing a backup plan, and they were willing to wait, but not as long as Garth. Dalton found out about the $250,000 offer through Darlene, who had heard it from Garth in a brief phone call. This time, Dalton did not call. He drove to the house. The two men stood on the front porch. Dalton had not come inside. Garth had not invited him. They faced each other with the careful distance of men who loved each other but had spent years failing to say so, standing close enough to touch, but far enough apart that neither one had to. "Dad, I'm not asking because of money." Dalton's voice was different now, not angry, not frustrated, something closer to fatigue, the fatigue of a man who has been carrying the same worry for years and can no longer pretend it weighs nothing. "I'm asking because you're 79. Mom is 76. What happens if you fall? If she gets sick again? $250,000 isn't play money, it's safety." Garth looked at his son for a long time. He saw something he had not seen before. Not the impatient young man who had slammed his fork down at Thanksgiving years ago. An older man, a worried one, a man who had spent his whole career fixing things that were broken and who could not fix this. "I understand you're worried," Garth said, "but I'm not finished." "Finished with what?" "You'll know." Dalton exhaled slowly. He got back in his truck and drove away. But something had shifted. He was no longer fighting his father. He was trying to protect him. And Garth recognized the difference, even if he could not yet bridge it. The years turned again. In the spring of 2019, Garth Callister did something he had never done before. He hired someone to mow Parcel 7C. He was 82 years old. His knees ached in the morning and did not stop aching until he had walked at least a quarter mile. His lower back seized if he twisted the wrong way. The push mower that he had loaded in and out of his truck for 18 years now felt like it weighed twice what it used to. His grip was not what it had been. His wind was not what it had been. The half-mile walk that used to take him 20 minutes now took 35, and he had to stop twice to catch his breath. He stood at the edge of Route 9 and watched a 20-year-old kid from town run the mower down the strip, while Garth leaned against his truck with his arms folded, 12 feet wide, half a mile long. The kid finished in 40 minutes. Garth paid him $30 and drove home in silence. That night, for the first time, he wrote something personal in the notebook. Not a date, not an offer, not a name. A contingency. "If I am gone, Darlene will know what to do." It was the first time in 18 years that he had acknowledged, even to himself, that he might not live long enough to see the end of what he had started. Then Lenore got sick. It began in the winter of 2020 with a cough that did not go away. By spring, the cough had become shortness of breath. By summer, Lenore was diagnosed with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. The damage was progressive and irreversible. She would not get better. She would only gradually get worse. Garth rearranged his life around her breathing. He cooked meals she had always cooked. He drove her to appointments she had always driven herself to. He sat beside her bed on the nights when the air felt too thin and the oxygen concentrator hummed in the corner like a mechanical heartbeat. One night in the autumn of 2021, Lenore called him to her bedside. Her voice was softer now, not weak but careful as if she were rationing her breath. "You remember that notebook?" "Which one?" "The one I gave you in 2001. Garth nodded. Lenore reached for his hand. Her grip was lighter than it used to be. "I never asked what you wrote in it. I trusted you." She paused to breathe. "But I need you to promise me something." "What?" "When it's done, tell Darlene, not Dalton. Darlene, she understands you." Garth held her hand tighter. "I promise." Lenore Callister died in February of 2022. At home, in the bed she had shared with her husband for 56 years. Garth was beside her. The oxygen concentrator went quiet for the first time in months. Garth did not cry in front of anyone. Not at the funeral, not at the reception afterward. Not when Dalton stood in the kitchen holding a plate of food he could not eat and said nothing because there was nothing to say. That night, after everyone had gone, Garth opened the notebook. He turned to a clean page and wrote 7 words. "Lenore, 58 years, no one trusted me longer than she did." At the funeral, Dalton had pulled Darlene aside. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Talk to Dad. Convince him to sell. He's alone now. He's old. He needs the money." Darlene looked at her brother. She loved him. She understood him. But she shook her head. "You know he won't. You're the lawyer. Make him understand." "I am the lawyer. That's exactly why I know he's right." Dalton looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked away. Not angry this time. Sad. 6 months after Lenore's death, Garth Callister was living alone for the first time in his life. The house was quiet in a way that no amount of radio or television could fix. Lenore's chair at the kitchen table sat empty. He could not bring himself to move it, and he could not stop looking at it. The notebook stayed in a drawer instead of on the table. Garth still paid his taxes. He still had the strip mowed by the kid from town. But something had loosened inside him. The certainty that had held him steady for 21 years had developed a crack not in his logic, but in his reason for caring. One evening in October of 2022, Garth sat at the kitchen table staring at the empty chair across from him. He opened the drawer and took out the notebook. He read it from the beginning. 21 years of entries, names, dates, amounts, observations. Then the last page, Lenore. He closed the notebook. Then he did something he had never done in 21 years of owning Parcel 7C. He picked up the phone and called the Brecken County Clerk's office. "I'd like to ask about the process for selling a piece of land." The clerk took down his information. Garth hung up. He sat in the quiet kitchen and listened to the house settle around him. For the first time since the auction in 2001, he was not waiting for something. He was wondering whether waiting had any meaning left. 2 days later, Darlene called during her weekly check-in. Garth mentioned the call to the clerk's office, his voice casual as if he were telling her about the weather. Darlene was silent for a very long time. "Mom said something to me before she died." Garth waited. "She said, when it's done, tell Darlene. She didn't say sell it. She said when it's done." More silence. "Dad, it's not done. You know that." Garth stared out the window at the dark field. The strip was out there somewhere, invisible in the night, 12 feet of grass he had maintained for more than 2 decades. "I know," he said. He never called the clerk's office again. Spring came to Brecken County in 2024 the way it always did, slowly, reluctantly, as if the land itself needed convincing. The dogwoods bloomed along Route 9. The fields turned green. And Ridgeline Development Group filed for final approval on a project that had been 20 years in the making. 340 acres east of Route 9. Retail, Housing, mixed-use commercial. The largest development Brecken County had ever seen. The filing was covered in the register. The county commissioners held a public hearing. Most people saw progress. Garth Callister saw paperwork. He drove to the county planning office on a Thursday morning and asked to see the permit file. The clerk handed him a stack of papers 3 inches thick. Garth did not need 3 inches. He needed 1 page. Page 31. The site access plan, road width, traffic flow, entrance points, turn lanes. And there it was. The main access road for the entire 340-acre project entered from Route 9 along the eastern boundary. It ran straight through a 12-foot corridor that had been surveyed in 1956, designated as Parcel 7C, and purchased at a bank auction in 2001 by a farmer who had been reading county records since before most of Ridgeline's employees were born. Garth folded the papers. He drove home. He sat at the kitchen table in his chair across from the empty one. Then he picked up the phone and called his daughter. "Darlene, I need you to look at something." "What kind of something?" "A permit application." There was a pause on the line, a long one. Then Darlene's voice came back, and it was different now. Steady, ready. "Parcel 7C. Garth smiled for the first time in months. "You remembered. You showed it to me when I was 12. You said someday it would matter." Garth looked out the window toward Route 9, toward the strip he had mowed and paid taxes on and protected and almost surrendered through 23 years and 1 marriage and 1 death and 1,000 quiet mornings of doing nothing but waiting. Someday is here. Darlene Callister drove from Knoxville to Brecken County on a Friday evening in late April of 2024. The drive took 3 hours. She made it in 2.5. She had not told her father she was coming early. She had not told Dalton she was coming at all. The permit file Garth had mentioned on the phone was sitting in her passenger seat, printed from the county's online portal, 64 pages held together with a binder clip. She had read it twice during her lunch break. The second time, her hands had gone still over the pages, the way her father's hands went still when he was certain about something. When she pulled into the driveway, Garth was standing on the porch as if he had been expecting her. He probably had. The man had spent 23 years anticipating what other people would do next. His own daughter arriving a day early would not have surprised him. They did not hug. That was not the way they greeted each other. Garth held the screen door open. Darlene walked in, carrying the permit file in her laptop bag. She set both on the kitchen table. The table, the same one where Garth had drawn the map in 1999. The same one where Darlene had stood at 12 years old and listened to her father explain that every road goes through somewhere. The same one where Lenore had sat every morning for 56 years in the chair that was now empty but had not been moved. Darlene looked at the chair. Then she looked at her father. "How are you, Dad?" "I'm here," he said, which was the most honest answer he had given anyone in 2 years. Darlene spread the permit file across the table. Next to it, Garth placed the original deed from 2001, the paper soft at the folds, now the ink slightly faded but still legible. Beside that, he set the notebook. 23 years of entries in his careful handwriting. Dates, names, offers, observations. And near the end, 7 words about Lenore that Darlene had never seen. She opened the notebook and read from the beginning. She did not rush. She turned each page the way her father turned pages, slowly, completely giving each entry the attention it deserved. When she reached the final written page, she stopped. She read the 7 words about her mother. She did not cry, but her jaw tightened in a way that Garth recognized because it was the same thing Lenore used to do when she was holding something inside. Mom knew everything. She didn't need to know everything. She just needed to trust. Darlene nodded once, then she closed the notebook and opened the permit file to page 31. Dad, their main access road runs directly through your land. Without it, they cannot break ground. Every utility connection, every traffic study, every emergency vehicle route on this plane depends on that entrance point. I know. Do they know you own it? Garth leaned back in his chair. For a moment, the old steadiness was back in his eyes. Not the hollow stillness of the past 2 years, but the original version, the one that had carried him through the auction, through the offers, through all of it. They're about to. 3 weeks later, the Brecken County Planning Office flagged Ridgeline's application. Before final approval could be granted, the developer was required to provide documented proof of legal access to the project site. The main entrance road crossed a parcel that was not owned by Ridgeline, had never been owned by Ridgeline, and was not subject to any existing easement agreement. Ridgeline's legal team assumed it was a formality, a title search, a missing signature somewhere in the chain of ownership. They assigned a junior associate to trace Parcel 7C through county records. It took 4 days. 4 days to learn what Garth Callister had known for 23 years. The parcel was privately owned. It had been purchased at a bank auction in 2001. The owner was still alive, still paying taxes, still maintaining the land. His name was Garth Callister. His address was a quarter-mile from the strip itself. The call came on a Thursday morning. Garth was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee from the same mug he had used for a decade, the chipped one, the one he had kept for himself when Theron Hartwell visited in 2016. The phone rang. Nashville area code, unknown number. He let it ring once, twice, then he picked up. Mr. Callister, my name is Theron Hartwell. I represent Ridgeline Development Group. I'd like to discuss purchasing your parcel along Route 9. Garth said nothing. We're prepared to offer $400,000, cash close within 30 days. $400,000 for land he had bought for $8,000, 50 times his purchase price. More money than he had earned in any 5-year stretch of his working life. Garth set down his coffee cup. I appreciate the call. Hartwell exhaled on the other end, the sound of a man who believes the hard part is over. So you'll consider it? Garth kept his voice level. It means I appreciate the call. Then he hung up. He sat at the table for a moment looking at the phone. Then he picked it up again and dialed Darlene. They offered $400,000. What did you say? I hung up. Darlene was quiet. He could hear her breathing the particular rhythm she had when she was thinking 3 moves ahead. What do you want, Dad? Garth looked through the kitchen window toward Route 9. Somewhere beyond it, the strip of land he had purchased, mowed, paid taxes on, almost sold, and ultimately kept, was sitting in the morning sun, 12 feet wide, half a mile of grass, 23 years of his life reduced to a question of what it was worth. I don't want to sell it. Then what do you want? I want what it's worth. Not what they're offering, what it's worth to them. Darlene took a long breath. Then I need to make a phone call. She called Theron Hartwell the following morning from her office in Knoxville. Her voice carried the calm authority of 16 years in courtrooms where land and money and legal precedent collided daily. Mr. Hartwell, I represent Garth Callister regarding Parcel 7C. Hartwell responded with the confidence of a man who had not yet recalculated. $400,000 is a very generous offer, Ms. Callister. Then open your client's permit file. Page 31. Your client's only viable access road runs through my father's land. That parcel is not worth what you want to pay for it. It is worth what you need it for. A pause. Hartwell was reading. My father will not sell, Darlene continued. He wants terms. What terms? A permanent easement, $4,500 per month, adjusted for inflation annually, transferable to his heirs in perpetuity. The silence on the other end lasted a long time, long enough for Darlene to hear Hartwell shift in his chair. long enough for her to know that he was doing the math and not liking the numbers. "I'll need to consult with my client," he said finally. "Take your time. We've been waiting 23 years. We can wait a little longer." Ridgeline went dark for 11 days. No calls, no emails, no counteroffers. The silence was deliberate. Darlene recognized the tactic from years of practice. When a party goes quiet after a demand, they are either preparing to walk away or preparing to fight. Given the $30 million at stake, walking away was not an option, which meant they were strategizing. Darlene used the time to prepare. She drove to the Brecken County Courthouse and spent 2 full days in the records archive, a basement room that smelled like old paper and air conditioning that had not been serviced since the building was last painted. She pulled every filing related to Parcel 7C, starting with the original 1956 survey and working forward through 6 decades of county records. She organized the tax records by year 63 manila folders spread across a conference table she had reserved under her bar number. Each folder contained a single document, the annual tax assessment for Parcel 7C, issued by Brecken County, payable to the county treasurer, listing the parcel as a separate and distinct piece of taxable real property. 63 consecutive years, not a single gap, not a single year in which the county had failed to recognize the parcel's existence or Garth Callister's ownership of it. She photographed every document. She created a digital timeline that started in 1956 and ended in the present, a continuous chain of evidence proving that the parcel had existed as a legally recognized piece of land for 68 years without interruption. She cross-referenced the tax records with county planning maps, zoning amendments, and road maintenance logs. Every source confirmed the same thing. Parcel 7C was real. It had always been real, and the county's own records proved it. On the 9th day of silence, Garth called Darlene. Not about the negotiation. He called to tell her that the kid from town had mowed the strip that morning. $30. The grass was getting thick with the spring rains. It was the kind of call that had nothing to do with what it was about. He was checking in. He was reminding himself and her that the land was still there, still his, still maintained. "The mowing looks good," he said. "I'm glad, Dad. You hear anything?" "Not yet." Garth paused. "Not yet," he repeated. And for the first time, the words sounded different coming from him. Not like patience, like recognition. He had spent 23 years saying those 2 words to other people. Now his daughter was saying them back to him. On the 12th day, Hartwell called back. His voice was measured professional, but Darlene could hear the edges of frustration underneath it, the sound of a man who had spent 11 days trying to find an alternative and had come up empty. $3,000 a month, 10-year term, non-transferable. Darlene called Garth. He listened to the counter without interrupting. When she finished, there was a pause. She could hear the kitchen clock ticking in the background, the same clock that had hung above the stove since before she was born. "Tell him no," he said. "You're sure?" "I've been sure for 23 years. She called Hartwell back. $4,500, permanent, final. Those are my client's terms. They have not changed. They will not change. Hartwell's voice tightened. "Ms. Callister, your father is not the only option available to my client. Then find another one. I'll wait." The line went dead. Darlene set down her phone and looked at the timeline she had built, 68 years of evidence spread across her office wall. She thought about her father sitting in his kitchen drinking coffee from a chipped mug, looking out the window at a strip of grass that nobody else had ever valued. She thought about her mother's voice on that last night, the careful rationing of breath, the hand reaching for Garth's. She thought about the composition notebook with the marbled cover, $1.49 at the drugstore, now containing the most valuable record in Brecken County. He could not find another option. They both knew it. The geography had not changed in 68 years. It was not going to change in the next 68. 2 weeks after the final counteroffer, Ridgeline filed a legal challenge. Their attorneys argued that Parcel 7C had been functionally abandoned. No structures had been built on it. No agricultural use had been made of it. The owner had done nothing with the land for over 2 decades except mow it. Under Tennessee property law, they claimed the parcel should be considered abandoned and made available for public use, specifically for the road that would serve the largest development in the county's history. Darlene read the filing in her office alone after hours. She read it twice. Then she smiled, not broadly, not triumphantly, but the way a carpenter smiles when she sees that the joint she cut fits perfectly. She called Garth. "They're suing, claiming the land was abandoned." "I know it wasn't. I know you know. The question is whether the judge knows." Dalton heard about the lawsuit 3 days later. He did not call Darlene. He did not call a family meeting. He drove to the house on Route 9 and parked in the driveway beside his father's truck. Garth was on the porch. The evening was warm. Crickets had started up in the fields. Dalton climbed the steps and stood beside his father. He did not sit down. He put his hands in his pockets and looked out toward the road. "Dad, I don't understand you. I never have." Garth waited. "But I don't want you to lose this too. You already lost Mom. Don't lose the one thing you've been holding on to." Garth looked at his son. Dalton was not asking him to sell. For the first time in 20 years, Dalton was not asking him to do anything at all. He was standing beside him. "I won't lose it, Dalton. I've been preparing for this for 23 years. Dalton nodded slowly. Then he sat down on the porch step. He did not leave. He stayed through the evening, through the last light, through the first stars appearing over the tree line. It was the longest the two of them had been in the same place without arguing since Dalton was a teenager. The case was assigned to Judge Leland Beckett, 67 years old, a Brecken County fixture who had served on the bench for over 2 decades. He was known for 3 things: his knowledge of property law, his membership at the Brecken Hills Golf Club, and his Saturday morning rounds with Carver Mosley. When Darlene learned who would be hearing the case, she felt something cold settle in her stomach. She did not tell Garth. He did not need doubt added to the weight he was already carrying. But she had other information. 3 days before the hearing, Vivian Yarborough called. Vivian had not spoken to Darlene before. She introduced herself, carefully aware that a reporter calling a lawyer before a hearing could be misinterpreted. "Ms. Callister, I've been following Ridgeline for several years, not just here. In 2 other counties in Middle Tennessee, they use the same legal strategy. Filed abandonment claims against small parcel owners who were blocking access to their development sites. Both times the owners settled for below market value rather than fight." Darlene listened without interrupting. "Neither case went to trial, but the pattern is clear. This is not a good faith legal argument. It's a pressure tactic." Darlene thanked her and hung up. She did not plan to use the information in court. She did not need to, but it confirmed what she had already suspected. Ridgeline was bluffing. They did not believe they could win. They believed Garth would fold. They did not know Garth Callister. The night before the hearing, Darlene spread her documents across the kitchen table one final time. 3 stacks: the 1956 easement filing, the 1961 county resolution, 63 years of continuous tax assessments, each one recognizing Parcel 7C as a separate, distinct parcel of land. She looked at Garth. "Dad, there's one more thing I need." Garth reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, the same jacket he had worn to the auction in 2001. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges, creased from years of being carried and never unfolded. The original 1961 county resolution. The document that formally canceled the road expansion but preserved the parcel designation. The piece of paper that proved the county itself had chosen to keep Parcel 7C alive as a separate legal entity. Darlene stared at it. You've had this the whole time, since 1999. 25 years. Garth placed it on the table beside the other documents. Your mother told me to make sure you had everything you needed. Darlene picked up the resolution and held it for a moment. It weighed almost nothing, a single sheet of 63-year-old paper, but it was the keystone. Without it, her argument was strong. With it, her argument was airtight. The hearing was held in the Brecken County Courthouse on a Wednesday morning. The courtroom was small, built in the 1940s with wooden benches and windows that did not open all the way. It smelled like floor wax and old paper. Theron Hartwell sat at the plaintiff's table with a second attorney from Ridgeline's Nashville office. Behind them in the gallery sat Ridgeline's project director, a man in his 50s who kept checking his phone as if the outcome of the hearing might appear there before the judge announced it. Darlene sat alone at the defendant's table. Garth was in the gallery in the second row wearing the same clean shirt and work boots he had worn to the auction 23 years earlier. Judge Beckett entered. The room stood. He sat. The room sat. Ridgeline's attorney spoke first. He was polished and precise. He argued that Parcel 7C had been abandoned in all practical senses, no development, no productive use, no structures. The owner had done nothing more than mow the grass twice a year for 2 decades. The parcel was in effect a relic of a canceled government project that served no current purpose and should be made available to serve the public interest through the proposed development. He spoke for 18 minutes. He cited case law. He referenced precedent from 3 states. He used the phrase public benefit 7 times. Then Darlene stood. She placed 3 documents on the table in front of the judge. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture. She spoke the way her father spoke, quietly, directly, with the certainty of someone who has carried the answer for a very long time. Your Honor, I submit the original 1956 easement, filing establishing Parcel 7C as a distinct parcel. I submit the 1961 county resolution that canceled the road project but preserved the parcel designation. And I submit 63 consecutive years of tax assessments from 1961 to 2024, each one levied by this county against Parcel 7C as a separate piece of taxable land. She paused. The courtroom was silent. You cannot declare a parcel abandoned when the county that is now asking for its dissolution has taxed it as valid property every single year for 63 years. The county recognized it. The county billed for it. The county collected on it every year without exception. Judge Beckett examined the documents. He took his time. He read the resolution. He reviewed the tax records. He looked at the easement filing. The courtroom waited. Then he looked up at Ridgeline's attorney. Do you dispute these assessments? The attorney hesitated. He glanced at Hartwell. Hartwell gave no signal. No, Your Honor. Beckett nodded. The nod was slow, deliberate. The nod of a man who has spent 30 years on a bench and knows when a case is ended before the verdict is read. Parcel 7C remains a valid, separately designated parcel of land. The claim of abandonment is denied. Case dismissed. The gavel came down once. The sound was small in the old courtroom, but it carried. In the gallery, Ridgeline's project director stopped checking his phone. Theron Hartwell closed his briefcase. Garth Callister, sitting in the second row in his clean shirt and work boots, did not move. He did not smile. He did not look at anyone. He sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes forward, the way he had sat at the auction when Carver Mosley laughed and the room followed. But this time nobody was laughing. Ridgeline called Darlene that same afternoon. Theron Hartwell sounded different now. The Polish was gone from his voice. What remained was the sound of a man who had run out of options and knew it. Our client will accept your father's terms. Darlene was standing in the courthouse parking lot. The afternoon sun was warm on her face. She kept her voice even. $4,500 per month. Permanent easement. Adjusted annually for inflation. Transferable in full to his heirs and their assigns. Yes, we agree to all terms. I'll have the agreement drafted by end of week. She hung up and called Garth. He answered on the first ring. They accepted. Silence. She could hear him breathing. Slow, steady. Every term he asked. Every term. Another pause. Then Garth said a number. 47. What? My yearly taxes. $47 a year. 23 years. Now worth $54,000 every year. For the rest of my life, and after that for yours. 3 weeks later, the agreement was signed in a conference room at the Brecken County Clerk's office. Darlene had drafted the document herself. Theron Hartwell reviewed it with 2 associates. The signing took less than 15 minutes. When it was done, Hartwell shook Darlene's hand and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Garth filed the agreement with the county clerk personally. He walked up to the counter, handed over the document, waited for the stamp, and received his copy. Then he walked out of the building, crossed the parking lot, and got into his truck. He sat there for a moment. Then he reached under the seat and pulled out the old notebook with the marbled black and white cover, the one Lenore had bought for $1.49 at the drugstore in 2001. He opened it to the last written page, the one with Lenore's name on it, and turned to the blank page after it. He uncapped a pen and wrote one line. April 2024, done. He looked at the word for a long time. Then he closed the notebook, placed it on the passenger seat, and started the engine. Carver Mosley read about the agreement in the Brecken County Register the following week. The article was written by Vivian Yarbrough. It was not a 3-sentence note in the county column. It was a full-feature 1,200 words front page below the fold. Vivian had spent years following the thread that began with a 6-figure refusal and ended with a permanent easement worth more than most houses in the county. She concluded the article with a single observation. Garth Callister did not defeat Ridgeline Development Group with money. He defeated them with time, and time is the one thing money cannot buy. Carver read the article at his desk at the bank. He read it twice. He did not laugh. He did not tell anyone about it. He folded the newspaper and placed it in his drawer, and he thought about a Tuesday morning 23 years earlier when he had stood in a room that smelled like old carpet and told a man in work boots that he had just thrown away $8,000. He had been wrong. He had been wrong for 23 years. And the worst part was not that Garth Callister knew it. The worst part was that Garth Callister had never cared whether Carver knew it or not. Dalton came to the house on a Saturday afternoon a week after the agreement was filed. He brought nothing with him. No food, no tools, no agenda. He parked in the driveway and walked to the porch where his father was sitting in the same chair he always sat in, looking out at the same field he always looked at. Dalton stood beside him for a while. Neither of them spoke. The afternoon was quiet. A truck passed on Route 9 in the distance. The shadow of the house stretched across the yard, reaching toward the gravel road, getting longer as the sun moved west. Dalton had driven 2 hours to get here. He had spent most of the drive rehearsing what he wanted to say the way he always rehearsed difficult conversations, turning the words over in his mind, the way he turned a pipe fitting in his hands, checking for the right angle, the right pressure, the right fit. But when he got to the porch, the rehearsed words dissolved. What came out instead was simpler and truer than anything he had planned. Dad, I didn't understand you. I still don't completely, but I was wrong. Garth looked at his son. Dalton was 45 years old. His hands were rough from decades of pipe wrenches and soldering torches. His face carried lines that had not been there the last time they had stood together on this porch. His hair was thinning at the temples, the same way Garth's had thinned at the same age. And for a moment, Garth saw himself in his son's face. Not the certainty, not the patience, but the worry. The constant, grinding worry of a man who loves his family and cannot always protect them. "You weren't wrong to worry," Garth said. "You were wrong to think I wasn't worrying too." Dalton exhaled. It was not a sigh, it was the sound of something being set down after being carried for a very long time. 20 years of frustration and confusion and the particular pain of loving someone you cannot understand. He sat down on the porch step. Garth stayed in his chair. They watched the light change over the field as the afternoon moved toward evening. A hawk circled over the tree line to the east, riding the thermals patient and unhurried. The air smelled like cut grass and warm earth, and the faint sweetness of honeysuckle growing along the fence line. They did not say much more, but for the first time in 20 years, the silence between them was not the silence of disagreement. It was the silence of two men who had finally arrived at the same place by different roads, at different speeds, but at the same place. And the silence was enough. Dewey Prescott showed up the following evening with a bottle of bourbon he had been saving for what he called an occasion worth opening it for. He climbed the porch steps with the careful deliberation of a man whose knees were no longer cooperative. "You remember when I told you that you were crazy," Dewey said. "I remember. I still think you're crazy, but it's the right kind of crazy." They sat on the porch and drank the bourbon slowly. Two old men watching the sun go down over land they had known their entire lives. They did not talk about the agreement or the money or Ridgeline or the lawsuit. They talked about the weather. They talked about a mutual friend who had died the previous winter. They talked about nothing important, which was itself important, because it meant that the important things had already been settled. On a warm evening in early May, Garth Callister drove out to Parcel 7C one last time. He parked his truck on the gravel shoulder of Route 9, turned off the engine, and stepped out. The door creaked the way it had creaked for 15 years, a sound so familiar it had become part of the landscape of his daily life, as ordinary and as permanent as the road itself. The strip stretched in front of him, 12 feet wide, half a mile long, running south along the road until it disappeared around the gentle curve. The grass was green and freshly mowed. The kid from town had been out the previous week. The boundary markers were clean and straight, the same ones Garth had maintained since 2001, repainted every 3 years, checked after every heavy rain, replaced twice when the county road crew accidentally knocked one loose with a grading blade. To the east beyond the strip, the Ridgeline land spread out flat and wide. Survey stakes dotted the ground like a field of small orange flowers. Construction tape fluttered from posts driven into the earth at regular intervals, marking the outlines of roads and foundations that did not yet exist, but soon would. Within a year, maybe less, there would be concrete trucks and framing crews and the sound of nail guns echoing across the fields. There would be houses with driveways and mailboxes, and families who would never know that the road they drove to get home passed through 12 feet of ground that an old farmer had once mowed with a push mower on Saturday mornings. But the quiet was still here now, and so was Garth. He walked the strip, slowly, not with the push mower he had used for 18 years, and not with the urgency of a man who needed to get somewhere. He walked it the way you walk a piece of land that you know completely, the way you know the rooms of your own house, by feel, by memory, by the particular way the ground gives under your boots after a week of rain. He knew where the soil was softer near the drainage ditch. He knew where the thistles grew back every July, no matter how many times they were cut. He knew the exact spot where the mockingbird always sang from the telephone wire in the patch near the southern end, where the clover grew thickest and the bees gathered in summer. 12 feet. It had always seemed like such a small number. 12 feet was the width of a modest bedroom, the length of a dining table with all the leaves in, the distance from a pitcher's rubber to a batter's gut feeling about whether the next pitch was coming inside. But 12 feet laid end to end for half a mile was enough. Enough to block a $30 million project. Enough to change one family's financial future for generations. Enough to prove that the value of a thing is not determined by its size, but by its position, by what it connects, by what cannot move forward without it. Garth reached the end of the strip and turned around. The sun was low over Route 9, throwing long shadows across the grass. His shadow stretched out in front of him, thin and long, reaching back toward his truck. For a moment he stood still and watched it, this dark outline of himself laid across the land he had owned for 23 years. And he thought about all the people who had stood on this same ground and seen nothing but grass. He had paid $8,000 for this land, $47 a year in taxes. He had mowed it 92 times over 23 years. He had turned down 80,000, then 120,000, then 250,000, then $400,000. He had almost sold it twice, once with the phone in his hand and 4 digits already dialed, once with a call to the county clerk that his daughter's voice had quietly reversed. Now it would pay him $54,000 a year for the rest of his life. And after his life, it would pay Darlene. And after Darlene, her children, if she had them. The agreement was permanent. The land remained his. The strip of grass that Carver Mosley had called a collection of problems was now producing more annual income than most working families in Brecken County earned. Garth walked back to his truck. He did not hurry. There was no reason to hurry anymore. The waiting was over. He drove home along Route 9 as the last light faded from the sky. The road was empty. The fields on either side were dark. The headlights of his truck cut through the dusk and lit up the yellow center line, and he followed it the way he had followed it 10,000 times before, home, to the house at the end of the gravel drive, home to the kitchen table and the empty chair and the drawer where the notebook now rested beside the deed. The house was quiet when he walked in. The kitchen table was clean. Lenore's chair sat where it had always sat, empty, unmoved. He had not moved it in 2 years. He would not move it for the rest of his life. It was not a shrine. It was not a memorial. It was simply the place where she had sat, and the fact that she no longer sat there did not mean the place had lost its purpose. Some absences are as important as any presence. Some empty chairs hold more meaning than any person sitting in them. The notebook lay on the counter where he had left it after filing the agreement. He picked it up and held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the accumulated weight of 23 years of patience recorded in his own handwriting on pages his wife had given him. $1.49 at the drugstore, the most important purchase anyone in this family had ever made. And it was not the $8,000 he spent on 12 feet of grass. It was the notebook that recorded why. He placed it in the desk drawer beside the deed. Then he closed the drawer. Garth Callister paid $8,000 for 12 feet of grass. He waited 23 years. He said no when saying yes would have been easier. He held on when letting go would have been painless. He sat at a kitchen table across from an empty chair and chose to keep a promise he had made to a woman who was no longer there to hear him keep it. He never bragged. He never called the bank. He never stood on the courthouse steps and pointed at the sky. He never needed anyone to know that he had been right all along, because being right was never the point. The point was being patient, The point was reading the map before anyone else bothered to look. The point was understanding that some things take 23 years to prove and that a man who is willing to wait that long has already won, whether the money comes or not. Some men collect problems. Garth Callister collected patience. And in the end, patience was worth more than everything else combined.